Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, we're finally doing it. In honor of Phyrexia All Will Be One, I'm finally gonna try tackling the commander that I told myself over and over again could never appear in the Upping the Average series. And it also happens to be the #1 commander of all time. Atraxa. We all know her by now, right? She commands more than 16,000 decks in the EDHREC database, proliferate every turn with a whole bunch of bonkers keywords. Yeah, the appeal here is clear. I fully believe you could cut out half her keywords and she'd still be awesome. Heck, she could be a 1/1 and she'd still be pretty good. And her EDHREC page also shows a bunch of other cards that are just as cool. Cards that put counters on all your creatures so Atraxa can buff them up to high heaven, Vorinclex, Deep Glow Skates, doubling everything, Planeswalkers that your opponents have to answer quickly, lest Atraxa pump them up to ult status in a very short time. But here's the problem. Let's take Atraxa's average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Archidect deck building website. And remember, as always, any swaps we make to the deck list in this series must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. So, here we have Atraxa's average deck. And what an exciting bunch of cards. Any single one of these can totally be a standout. They're splashy, they're appealing, this is one heck of a collection. However, keen viewers may already see a bit of a problem here. Take a careful look through all the cards showing up in this list. We have a lot of +1 counter cards, and then also a lot of random appearances of infect. And over on the side, we have a total of 8 planeswalkers. While I don't doubt that some players out there are building their Atraxa decks in this way, this is not at all a good representation of an Atraxa deck. To demonstrate why, let's go back to Atraxa's EDHREC page and use the advanced filters. Take note of the pie chart here, which shows the average type breakdown for the average Atraxa data, and especially note the number of planeswalkers. Now let's use the advanced filters to showcase only the deck data that includes a signature Atraxa planeswalkers card, for example, Oath of Teferi, an excellent card for Super Friends decks. When we filter that data out, bam! That pie chart is way different. 18 planeswalkers, not just 8. And really, her entire EDHREC page looks a little different now too. This is why we're constantly prattling on and on and on about the advanced filters on EDHREC. Frankly, if you're not using them yet, you're really only getting half of the experience. Atraxa is so good for so many different strategies, but when you squash them all together, none of those individual strategies really gets the chance to shine and show off its specialties. The data showed us an average of 8 planeswalkers in the deck, but that's because the Super Friends versions of Atraxa are playing a whole bunch of them, while the other versions of Atraxa, like infect or energy counters and all of those, are playing very, very few. You know, the average of 0 and 10 is 5, but that 5 doesn't tell you anything helpful about the 10 or about the 0. This is one of those commanders where the mean average doesn't get to showcase how dynamic and awesome the commander actually is. And that is why I didn't want to touch this commander for a series called Upping the Average. So that begs the question, what are we going to do about it? Well, for this video, I'm going to use another of EDHREC's features, the theme filters, which show the most common ways that the commander tends to be built. This is particularly helpful for super diverse commanders with many different build paths. Here we see the 3 most common ways that Atraxa gets built. Super Friends, which means the data shows that these decks have a high number of Planeswalker cards and Planeswalker helper cards. +1/+1 counters, which means these decks contain a high number of cards with text about +1/+1 counters, and infect, which means that these decks contain a high degree of cards with infect, poisonous, toxic, or any other method of giving out poison counters. And that is how we'll tackle this video. We'll use those theme filters and then take the average decks from each of those 3 themes and make our updates to each of them from there. We're tackling Atraxa Super Friends, +1 counters, and infect. So yes, this is going to be quite a journey. Let's get started with those planeswalkers. Ah yes, planeswalkers. The thing that Atraxa's probably most well known for? or most well hated for? It's a toss-up. The interesting thing about Atraxa is that it's very, very difficult to make cuts to these different decks. There isn't such a thing as a bad card for Atraxa, you know? So the stuff that we do cut, as painstaking as it will have to be done with the knowledge that we are making room for something that might have a bit more exciting synergy or slightly different upside in the future. And let's be real, we get a lot of really cool new planeswalkers in basically every single set, so there's always something exciting on the horizon for this version of the deck. As a heads up, several of the Atraxa lists that we are touring today feature some pretty hefty price tags. This is especially so for the Planeswalker version of the deck, because a lot of good Planeswalkers out there can command $20 plus price tags. So to some extent, this can be a very expensive strategy just in general. So yes, if you're wondering, I will indeed have an alternative budget deck list for this section after we make our core swaps. For now though, we still have to get acquainted with this current deck and especially with its MVP cards. Obviously, anything that adds additional loyalty to the Planeswalkers is a star here. The mission of the deck is to get those Planeswalkers protected and use them to control the board and reach their ultimate abilities. And I do mean control here. There are hundreds of Planeswalkers out there to choose from, but there are three primary things I'd say are the most important priority for which walkers we will choose to use. 1. Do they protect themselves and or our other walkers? Making tokens is an excellent way to do this, for example, and several of our walkers sport removal effects as well. Even just a couple of these on the field can really affect an enemy's ability to get in our way. 2. Do they provide us with advantages in some way? We don't have a lot of draw spells here, but Planeswalkers provide lots of value over time, and the ones that help us dig even further down into our deck will compound that effect even more. And 3, do they have an ultimate ability that will verifiably help us clinch victory? No Planeswalker ult wins the game outright, but we definitely want ultimate effects that get really dang close. So close that it's a cinch to finish the game in a very short amount of time. And this will inform some cuts and swaps later. So now let's actually get to it. We're how many minutes in and I still haven't gotten to cuts yet. Sorry, there's just a lot of ground to cover. And I'll start by admitting a bias up front and say that apparently in this video I have it out for the birds. Birds of Paradise and Thrumming Bird just don't thrill me super much. Conditional Proliferate with Summoning Sickness is awkward to me, and I mean Birds of Paradise is really cool in a lot of places, and here it's even a fine blocker, but it just doesn't feel to me like the best use of our money, I guess. I'll also admit that I've fallen out of love with Inexorable Tide for Planeswalker decks too. This is a big mana cost for a gradual effect, that's all. With the release of All Will Be One, we now have a high density of other proliferate effects with significantly cheaper mana costs. And one of the primary issues a Planeswalker deck already has is that a lot of its cards can cost a lot of mana, so here I just don't think it keeps up. Speaking of mana, 35 lands isn't it for me, not in a Planeswalker deck. I'll throw at least one more in here, one that can give us any of our colors. Many test hands with this current list struggled to ever reach like 5 lands to deploy walkers in the first place, so just don't neglect your mana base here. Non-red decks are about value over time. We do not want to miss land drops. And while I'm here, I'll also mention that I am a huge fan of this new Experimental Augury card. It's good to play early when we need to dig for something, and it's a great late game bonus upside as well. This spell tax Proliferate onto an already good cantrip effect. I really like this thing to help smooth out our draws. Finally, the big ticket, the Planeswalkers themselves. These here are among the best of the best, but there are a few others that I really think deserve a spot in this list too, which means we have to make some grueling cuts. And after a lot of thinking, I landed on 2. Tamiyo and Jace. Hear me out, let me make my case. These provide good advantage and can help control the board, but they do little to help end the game. To an extent, I feel similarly about Narset Transcendent. Jace and Narset both have ultimates that crash the game to a halt rather than making it end, and I think that's a critique worth bringing up. In fact, there are actually several walkers here who are cheap to cast, but who don't have ultimate abilities at all, and whose primary function is therefore to control the board and restrict enemy activity. I'll admit I'm actually not a huge fan of these, but I totally get why they're here. This deck is some cutthroat competition, which means it'll be played up against cutthroat competition, and that means you probably need a bit of help to create the onboard conditions that will allow your walkers to survive long enough to reach an ultimate in the first place. So control walkers will help you do exactly that. I'm just also greedy. I like planeswalkers with ultimates that will properly end a game rather than slowing the game down. And it's usually a bad idea to judge a planeswalker by their ultimate abilities in EDH, but like ultimating a planeswalker is the whole point of this specific deck, so I consider this the exception that proves the rule. So anyway, that affects my evaluations of planeswalkers here. Jace and Tamiyo are control and value more than they are game enders, and I find that this deck is craving a different batch of exciting walkers that fulfill similar roles and also can help end the game. To be clear, I am nitpicking here. I'm only suggesting these specific cuts here because of the highly tuned state that this current deck list is in. We will see these planeswalkers again for the budget version of the deck. Trust me, they're good cards. In any case, I just want to make some room for a couple of other walkers, namely the new Wanderer, an old Vraska, and a very cursed Garruk are all very exciting. The new Wanderer is nigh impossible to hit, and it clears the board when we need it to. Garruk, I consider a lot like Elspeth's Sun's Champion. It makes a lot of tokens, it kills things when we need it, and if we ult it, it creates a devastating emblem that works for all the tokens that our walkers produce. And Vraska's ultimate is just about the best game-ending ultimate that we could ask for. That right there is a very exciting and very effective Planeswalker finale. Those are my swaps for the tuned-up Planeswalker version of Atraxa, and you can find a link to the decklist in the description below, but we're not done with the walkers yet, because this deck is expensive, and I just can't resist trying to help make a somewhat more budget version. So let's do what we can here. I'm going to try cutting any card that costs over about $10. So Doubling Seasons, Vorinclex, Tithe, Rift, a couple of big name walkers, the whole works. And keep in mind that it's very hard to build a bad Atraxa deck. You do not need these $60 cards for this deck to be good, you know? Alright, those are cut, and I'm also going to modify the mana base in a quick swoop here. Less fetches and less $10 duels and triomes, and more of the typical budget mana base classics. That saves us at least $200. Okay, we have a lot to add, so let's get to it. We lost 6 planeswalkers, so who's going in their place? Well, as you may have guessed, Tamiyo and Jace returned because, again, they're still very dang good. I'll also include 2 black walkers, Tevish and Ob. I like Tevish's blockers and his card draw, and I really like Ob's control and his ultimate. And finally, Kiora is control, and her ult is very funny, even if it is slow. And Vraska's plus ability is not good, but her ultimate is terrifying, especially if we're making a lot of tokens. So all of that gives us a new Planeswalker loadout that I'm pretty dang happy with. Adjust your walkers as you feel necessary. You should feel excited to play any of them. That's the point of the Planeswalkers in a Planeswalker deck, after all. Alright, we lost some mana resources in the budget culling, so I'll also include a Faburo Elder to help make tons of mana from our commander. And a personal favorite here is Relic of Legends, which can tap our planeswalkers to make additional mana. This thing is just hilarious. In the interest of defenses, I really like Spike Weaver a lot. This card just fogs and fogs and fogs forever. It's very hard to get through. We happen to lose a board wipe too, so Merciless Eviction can sub in to help us respond to whatever needs clearing out. Oh, and in addition to that, we lost a couple of card advantage sources when we were making cuts, so let's get some flavorful stuff in here. The new Izuri and Phyrexian Arena are literally right at home here. Phyrexian Arena is cheap to get right now, but it might not be for long. Who knows what the price will look like in the future. And hey, speaking of proliferate, since we no longer have huge counter-doubling stuff like Doubling Season, let's go wild with cards like Planeswide Celebration and Broker's Confluence. The Confluence is especially versatile. If we happen to stick a Planeswalker in play, either of these can help us proliferate into a Planeswalker ultimate from almost out of nowhere, and that's silly fun. And finally, my last addition is so fun for Planeswalker decks, and that is Peregrine Dynamo. It blocks super well, and it doubles up the activations of a loyalty ability. Yeah, this is fire. I'm very excited to try it out here. Ooh, that was a lot. You can find both of the Super Friends decks in the description below, and oh man, that was just part 1? Yeah, it's time for us to get to part 2. Let's talk now about Atraxa +1 counters. Interestingly, this version of an Atraxa deck happens to have the most in common with the original 2016 Breed Lethality precon from which Atraxa originated. And this is both a good and a bad thing for us. On the one hand, it does mean that we spot a couple of precon holdovers that probably haven't really withstood the test of time so much, but on the other hand, it does mean that the strategy is extremely straightforward, knows exactly what it is, has no nonsense going on, and it also happens to be really really good at what it does. Okie doke, let's reacquaint ourselves with this version of the deck. This requires a pretty substantial mental shift because the first version of the deck was much more about defense and control, but this version is substantially more about accumulation and long-term beatdown. One counter becomes two becomes a few becomes several, and several becomes lethal. Here, the thing that we're more keen to defend is our board presence, an army full of ever-growing creatures. So our defenses and our protective abilities to keep creatures alive are at a much bigger premium. Getting to know this deck's key cards, all those counter modifiers and doublers, will again play a big role in this version too. But we have some new faces joining that party as well, hoping to turn every Atraxa proliferation into an application of not just 1, but 2, 3, 4 counters every single turn. We get some classic +1 counter payoffs too, helping win the game just through sheer size of our creatures, or doubling things so high with unblockability or with trample that our opponents will fold to just a few swings in the red zone. Plus, a lot of cards here are here to help with one of the deck's most awkward hurdles, which is just trying to get a counter onto Atraxa herself so that she can grow her own power, not just those around her. So, with that understood, let's get cutting. First, these two Planeswalkers. I don't care for them here. They can put counters onto things, including Atraxa herself, but they cost more mana to do this than I personally have patience for. Putting counters onto our creatures is a lot easier than these cards make it. And in this version of the deck, I don't value these things that we have to protect that can give counters, as much as I value creatures that can give counters and that will also wear those counters really well too. I will again admit in the creature section that I still don't care much for Thrumming-Bird in this list, nor do I like the card Fertilid. Sorry to both, I just think they're slow, and probably pre-con holdovers. Like, if we like the Thrumming-Bird, why isn't Grateful Apparition in this list too, you know? Surely you'd want both. Well, I don't want either. And, much like the last list, I also think Inexorable Tide is too slow for a +1 counters Atraxa deck too. It's a cool card, but the mana cost and its timing grow more and more awkward as more sets go by and Phyrexia's power increases. As it happens, I'm also not a fan of Bred for the Hunt. This is a very circumstantial card advantage spell. In my opinion, it's worse than other versions of this effect that we've seen, like Recon Mission, and even then, on-hit draw effects are better for decks that go wide with lots of tokens, rather than decks like this that tend to go a little bit more tall. I'd like to cut this card and replace it with more reliable card advantage a little bit later on. Continuing the cuts, I'll also bring up two other creatures that just don't thrill me as much as they used to. Varel and Juniper are, again, just kinda slow, but I also just don't think they fit the deck that well. Juniper, for example, will come down the turn after Atraxa, and Varel just doubles a single creature. But that's not important to us as affecting multiple creatures. Also, it takes multiple turns before he can do this because of summoning sickness, and in any case, doubling +1 counters is a thing that we've seen lots of other spells do for like only 2 or 3 mana, so both of these just don't really sing to me. Okay, that was a lot of big cuts, but now, what are we adding? Well, first, this deck needs lands. 34 lands is silly. I know we want to play all of the big, fun, exciting cards, but to cast them, we actually need to hit land drops. So I'm getting Path back in here, as well as the Graft land. Atraxa players are probably already very familiar with this one, and I totally get if some folks have fallen out of love with it because it's a single color and because it enters tapped. But I find myself pretty eager to get counters onto Atraxa by any means necessary. Oh, and side note, this deck also happens to be missing a Path to Exile from its removal. It has other great removal spells like the Swords to Plowshares and stuff like that, but let's make sure that we fill in that part of the box as well. Just making sure we've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. After that, it may not be exciting, but this deck needs more reliable card advantage, so I'm stuffing all of these in here. A creature-based deck needs to protect its board, and when it can't achieve that, it needs enough cards in hand to try and claw back into the game, rather than just getting stuck top-decking for the rest of the game. Rishkar's expertise is no mystery, we all know it. This card's amazing, especially in a deck with so many creatures that can get huge. Painful Truths is a personal favorite. I love 3 for 3, and I'm also super into Falco Spara here, who not only has proliferatable shield counters, but he also wears +1 counters really well, and he can turn any of our creature counters into tons more card advantage. Yes, please! More. I can't get enough of synergies like this. Finally, I have 2 other cards to add that will help Atraxa get her counters in a very fun way. Master Chef seems tailor-made for this version of an Atraxa strategy. Make her enter with a counter, and then so does everything else, and they just keep getting bigger from there. This card plants seeds that grow over time. And then this one's a bit more cheeky, but I like Slip Out the Back a lot here. Atraxa has a target on her back big time, and this card helps her escape every type of removal spell, and it gives her a counter if she doesn't have one already. Brilliant. And those are the swaps. But I also have honorable mentions. If you're going expensive with this deck, get a Great Henge in here stat, cause it's bonkers. The deck would love a Teferi's Protection too, but then again, who wouldn't, right? Protection spells and draw spells are your friend when you are tuning this one up. And this version of the deck also didn't have as lavish of a mana base as the other one, so you can also tune that up to your heart's content as well. And on the flip side, if you're going to build this deck on more of a budget, well, there are actually only a few big price culprits here. Ozolith, Sword, Doubling Season, Vorinclex, Rift, and Branching Evolution. Cut just 6 cards from this deck, and you save, no joke, almost $300. Heck, $400 if you go even more budget with your mana base. And in their place, look for some fun stuff. Have Gaia's Gift and Snakeskin Veil join that Slip Out the Back to protect and deploy counters on valuable creatures. I like Hadana's Climb a lot too, as a just fantastic finisher. And in lieu of Doubling Season effects, well, counter-doubling spells are a huge blowout. These can really surprise your enemies from out of nowhere. Whew, okay. That's part 2 done. Here is our +1 counter Atraxa list. But you know that we're not done yet. We have one final version to tackle, the one most affected by the new Phyrexia set. Let's talk infect. Some of the cuts in this section might be a little awkward. Some folks like to build Atraxa Poison not just as Atraxa Poison, but also as Atraxa Phyrexia theme, and that bleeds into the data that we've got here, which can make it a little bit awkward when we're trying to specifically increase the potency of the poison strategy, and that's worth keeping in mind. If you want a Phyrexia theme deck, by all means, go ham, that's awesome. But here we are really going to try and focus on how to make the deck more toxic, literally. Man, what a sight. Of the 3 versions of this deck we've seen so far, this one is definitely the one with the most aggressive overall game plan. Poke each opponent for at least 1 poison, hopefully tons more, and Atraxa will fill in the gaps if the poison aggro ever happens to sputter out of steam. Just a few extra proliferations can go a long, long way. And the new Phyrexia All Will Be One set has given this version of the strategy a few new toys that are already starting to crop up in Atraxa's average data. But there are definitely some more that she'll be eager to add in too. So it's our job to find some cuts to help make room for those newcomers. First, though, we have to figure out our most essential cards, our biggest MVPs that guide the entire deck. Obviously, infect creatures are a highlight. It is important to note that their power and poison output can grow if we happen to place counters on them, but it's even more important to note that in this list, that's actually very, very rare. There are only maybe 2 cards that could even gesture at putting counters on our creatures, so it doesn't seem to me that we must place the highest possible value on infect above our other forms of poison distribution. Just getting poison counters out there at all costs is our primary focus, and these core cards will help us achieve that. In fact, cards that just outright give out a poison counter, like Icarats, are especially good to help us get the ball rolling and instill that fear in our enemies. Importantly, this version of Atraxa has the greatest number of swaps for us to make, because there are a lot of new amazing cards that we want to play, so I'm going to try and do these in broad sections. Sorry to say it, but some of the old infectors don't stand up to modern scrutiny now that we have a lot of new, evasive, toxic creatures. Look at that flying! Look at this evasion! Just some 2-mana 1/1 might be mana efficient, but it's dang hard to get through enemy defenses. But flyers are awesome. Some of the infect cards that we had very, very much cared about other cards with infect, but as we adapt to new types of creatures, we will have fewer outright infect creatures for those to synergize with. And it's fine to change with the times, because in exchange, we get more powerful, more evasive, or even token-making creatures, and even ones that help proliferate. Heck, some of these even come with card advantage. It's a hefty switch up to the creature base, and not all of these swaps will correlate 1 for 1, but overall, I think these give us more of what the deck actually needs to help us punch through enemy lines. This is a new type of creature loadout, but it should help us be more consistent at giving out infect counters early and having Atraxa proliferate things from there. After that, though, I'm sorry to say it, but Elish Norn and Gix appear to me to be here more for flavor than for outright function, so I will be changing them out. Next again, I'm sorry, apparently though, I just hate birds. The proliferator flyers don't make the cut for me here, and actually, neither do a couple of the other proliferator spells either. Clasp and several other friends just feel too clunky nowadays, especially when we have spells that just give people poison counters outright. Remember how much Atraxa loves Icarats? We have so many more Icarats effects now! Plus, these other new proliferator cards are just bomb because of how versatile they are. These are just good value and a very big upgrade for our deck. I mean, seriously, there's even a mana rock that proliferates now, and yes, we're playing it. And it gives us extra mana if we, what the heck? This is terrifying, I tell you, absolutely terrifying. And actually, speaking of mana, this deck still needs at least one more land, y'all, so I'm including Path of Ancestry again. And it's actually at its most relevant here, because according to errata, Atraxa is Phyrexian, so we'll get a lot of Scry in this deck. And finally, this might be kind of contentious, but I don't know. Counterspell is cute, but I like the Corrupted Resolve here better for the theme, and Damn is a fine card, but there are two other removal cards that I just have to get into this deck, so I'm sacrificing these two spells at the altar. Phyresis Outbreak and White Sun's Twilight are just too good not to play here. One-sided Wraths all the way. Long live Phyrexia. Woo, that was a lot, but what a thrill. And of course, we have honorable mentions, some of which may seem pretty familiar. Cut out 5 cards, and again, you'll save $250. Vorinclex could instead be a Broker's Confluence. Cyclonic Rift could just be Damn again. Sword of Truth and Justice, you don't need it. Maybe you can exchange it for Choirmaster, because that's a cool proliferated card too. Instead of Rhystic Study or Demonic Tutor, try out the new Necrogen Communion card and Distorted Curiosity. And if you go with a less optimized mana base, you'll save another $200 on top of that. It doesn't have to cost us a lot of money to exert the will of Phyrexia onto our enemies. And all of that will leave us, at last, with our final list. Atraxa, I hope you had the time of your life. You can find a link to all the deck lists in the description below, with their cuts in the maybe board. You gotta love that Atraxa tension, because she sure attracts attention. If you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow Phyrexians, make sure you raise your Praetors voices down in the comments below. All hail Phyrexia, and thanks so much for watching.